Today we have an excellent debate, or at least I think it's going to be an excellent debate. It's between Walter Block, which has been an Austro-libertarian scholar for 50 plus years, versus Charles Peralo. I had a talk with Charles Peralo maybe a few weeks ago, and I said, hey, is it okay if I introduce you as the a notorious, hated, or something along the likes of that? He was like, I kind of like notorious better. So anyhow, Mr. Peralo wrote two scathing pieces against Murray Rothbard, and the first one was entitled "Something Libertarians Must Admit: Murray Rothbard Sucked." So Tom Woods on his podcast mentioned this piece, I think without actually mentioning his name, and Joe Salerno was on it, Jeff Deist, somebody else, Jeff Deist, Joe Salerno. Help me out, guys. Who else was it?
Bob Murphy.
Jeff Deist.
Lou Rockwell. That's right. Thanks, Peralo. And then he responded, and he put together another piece. Dear Tom Woods, Murray Rothbard did indeed suck. He seems to like that word a lot. So who better to defend the great Murray Rothbard than one of his star pupils, Dr. Walter Block? And where better, besides the Mises Institute, of course, to do that than the Rothbardian Circle? Of course, the answer is nowhere, right? So let me see if I can pull out some excerpts here from what he wrote so I can rile you guys up, if you aren't already. Let's see. My name is Luis Rivera, and I'm the chairman of the Rothbardian Circle / America's Future Foundation. And hi to everybody watching all across the country, in Brazil, Spain, Argentina. I know you guys are watching. So basically, his tenets are: the man, Murray Rothbard, never got a damn thing done, he says. He was a total political moron. And we'll leave it at that. I'll let Block tackle the rest. So, without further ado, Charles Peralo will be coming out. You can hit the music now.
I didn't know this was
Hello. I had to do that.
All right, dude. Charles Peralo, everybody. Give him a warm welcome. He actually chose that music, believe it or not.
It was recommended.
Really?
By you.
No?
By Lou.
Okay. Now, everybody, get ready for the man that's either going to be retired by Charles Peralo, or he's going to put Charles Peralo, who Tom Woods called juvenile, in his place. So, whatever transpires here, make sure that you all know, if you talk bad about Murray Rothbard, this is what's going to happen to you.
This is going to be the red letter from Game of Oh, there you go.
The good force. Oh, you could have left it playing. I kind of like that song. Yeah. For dramatic effect. Okay. Yeah, leave it there. It's fine. I can talk over it. Okay. So, the way we're going to do this is we're going to have 4 topics. 1, Murray Rothbard. 2, Milton Friedman. 3, libertarianism. And finally, 4, economics. Now, Milton Friedman was no Austrian. Murray Rothbard was. And then, was Milton Friedman a libertarian? If so, how much? How much good did he do for this libertarian movement? And the same question is posed to Murray Rothbard. So, these two debaters will have a 5-minute opening statement, followed by 10 minutes on each of these topics, with 5-minute rebuttals. Then we'll have some questions from the audience, both here in attendance, all 3 of you, plus all of those watching via these 2 magnificent channels. So, another thing, please like our page if you haven't already, Rothbardian Circle / America's Future Foundation, and also check out and like Liberty Hangouts, friends of ours. Okay, so first up is Charles Peralo. I'll have 5 minutes.
Where are my notes?
I was like, this is not libertarian, right?
Where are my notes?
Oh, sorry, here.
This is not libertarian, correct? The open libertarian. We're just trying to cover all. Okay, sure. Okay, I never expected I was going to get an introduction to Darth Vader music, but you know what? I'm really not that shocked at all. So first off, thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for people watching this online. But I think the biggest thank you goes to Dr. Walter Block over there, and I actually brought this. This was from about, I'd say 5 years ago. I organized a lecture for the good doctor at Columbia, and he did sign the book saying, thank you, Charles, for assembling this, and he actually took it back with him and later mailed it to me again. But I did not write a book called The Great Bill Weld, but if I do, I will send you a mailed copy. So, going into the first topic of just like libertarianism as a whole, I think we have to talk before we say Murray Rothbard or Milton Friedman. We have to sort of get our philosopher on and say another great libertarian, Ayn Rand. And she would always just combat things with 4 simple questions which were fundamental to how humans confront any problem. Who are we? Where are we? How did we get here? And now what? And what now? Who are we? We're libertarians. What is libertarianism? It is the platform of you own yourself and nobody can regulate that. Nobody can say you can't smoke marijuana, nobody can interrupt your phone calls, no one can disturb commerce. But if you're going to hurt someone, it's going to be a problem. If you're going to regulate something, it's going to be a problem. We all understand that. That's the basic thing right here. But where we go past that in the debate, I feel, is we have this. I don't want to debate the topic so much of what is libertarianism, because I think that's well established. I think it's more of, at this point, you see someone like Friedman, you see someone like Rothbard, you see Gary Johnson, you see Ron Paul, and you just get all of these topics where it comes to a point where it's not so much they disagree, but it's how to do it. So where are we right now? We're in the loser circle. In 2008, Ron Paul ran up against the guy who looked like Skeletor, some mayor who never shut up about 9/11, and some guy named Huckabee, and got 5%. He got 10% going up against a religious fundamentalist from Pennsylvania, the Mormon version of Hillary Clinton, and then some guy named Newt. And 2016, we have Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, two-term governors, go up against Biff Tannen from the Back to the Future movies, and Granny Nixon, and he gets 3-4%. So we've lost badly the last 3 elections, and I look back in history. Calvin Coolidge was maybe not a libertarian in definition, but pro-free market, pro-civil liberties, not a huge interventionist. Maybe not that great on immigration, but overall pretty good. You go to Robert Taft in the Senate, who was the Republican Senate Majority Leader, almost was the president. He wins. You look at Barry Goldwater, got the Republican nomination. But then after that, it dies, and it seems the liberty movement just became sort of what the conservative movement is now, and that's owned by a guy who, quite frankly, is, I would say, Donald Trump, and I'd say insane. Anti-trade, anti-immigrant, anti-civil liberties on many fronts. It doesn't work. So we're in the loser circle. How did we get here? I would say libertarianism originates from classical liberalism in basic principle. We go to the 15th century, we look at that, and we say, okay, the 15th century existed with the shipping industry. We had, for the first time, people do all this international trade, and they sort of govern themselves to the first degree. So libertarianism, classical liberalism, call it what you want. It transpirals through history, American Revolution, the Constitution, go to the 20s, go to the New Deal, the Progressive Era, we get the 50s, and libertarianism is coined. And I'll say it, Murray Rothbard probably was the one to coin the term, so he does get some reds on that. But we got to a place where we just lose every election. And we have right now 2 million people in jail for the war on drugs. We have globally, we have fiat currency where inflation is expected, and we're losing. So how did we get here? I don't know the answer to that right away. I think maybe just the message of promising free stuff or promising to hate people wins. But what do we do now? What I'm just going to say from this debate, I'm going to say pragmatism, and I'm going to say instead of perhaps going hard on anarchy, going hard on this direct front of libertarianism and a philosophical front, we discuss things issue by issue, and we act a lot more like my man Milton Friedman, and also my man Bill Weld. So I think that is the point, and I think the good doctor deserves his next stop right here.
I think that microphone's better.
This microphone, this one isn't on at all.
This one's better.
Notice he grabbed the good one. Just
Well,
kidding, I'm
I
just
claimed
kidding.
the property first,
Hope said it is.
and I got the rights to it.
Thanks to Louis for putting this on and for his group, and I'm delighted to see you all here, and I'm glad that we're out into TV land or whatever land that these cameras are going to, so more people will hear about this. I'm having an opening statement about libertarianism. The way I see libertarianism, there are 4 different elements of it. The top is anarcho-capitalism. Why do I place anarcho-capitalism at the top? Because I think libertarianism consists of maybe 2 or 3 planks, and anarcho-capitalism is the most congruent with them. What are these planks? One is the non-aggression principle. Keep your mitts to yourself. Don't grab other people or their property without their permission. Boxing is okay because you agree to be punched, and if somebody punches you in the jaw, if you're in the boxing match, you can't sue him for assault and battery because you agree to be punched above the belt. So that would be one element of libertarianism, the non-aggression principle. The second one would be private property rights, because here's a young man, he's got a MAGA hat on, and suppose I go over to him and I grab the hat off of his head. Have I now interfered with his, have I been an aggressor? Have I violated the non-aggression principle? Well, it all depends upon who is the legitimate owner of the hat. If he stole it from me yesterday, then he's the criminal, even though today I'm grabbing. On the other hand, it's his hat. I didn't see that hat before, so I'd be the criminal if I grabbed it. So we need some sort of theory of property rights, and libertarians go along with John Locke and Murray Rothbard and Hans Hoppe, who have done more than any other 3 people to establish property rights. And the third is free association. The only problem with rape and slavery is there's no free association. The rape victim doesn't want to associate with the rapist. The slave doesn't want to associate with the master and yet is forced to. So free association is also very important. And anarcho-libertarians, such as Murray Rothbard, are sound as a bell on all 3. Indeed, are almost the creators of this, as I will argue that Murray Rothbard really created the modern libertarian movement. So I place anarcho-capitalism at the top of the heap. Second down would come minarchism, or minimal government libertarianism. And here the 2 people most heavily associated with it are Ayn Rand and, what's his name from Harvard, Robert Nozick. And the idea here is government should exist, whereas for the anarcho-capitalists, government is a per se violation of the non-aggression principle and shouldn't exist because they compel you to pay taxes and they order you around even though you didn't agree to be ordered. But in the minimal government libertarian view, there is a legitimate government and has only one function, and that is to uphold the non-aggression principle. Of course, if they tax you, they're sort of violating it, but what the heck? Can't have everything. And to that end, we need 3 institutions to protect person and property. And one is armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, not to go exporting democracy, but to just defend the country. Second, local police to keep local bad guys off of us, not to have victimless criminals, but just stopping assault and murder and rape. And third, courts to decide who the good guys and the bad guys are. Third, down in the list, is constitutionalists, and the most famous one is Ron Paul. And the view here is whatever the Constitution says, but not as interpreted by modern people, but interpreted the way they meant it when they wrote it. And the Constitution is pretty good, so I consider them the third group of libertarians. And then the fourth, I'm a big tent kind of a guy, so I include what I call the fourth group, and that's classical liberals. And the most famous classical liberals are Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. And they are free enterprisers, but they have all sorts of compromises with the non-aggression principle and private property rights and free association. Also, they favor welfare, they favor this, they favor that. But they are sort of free enterprises, so as a big tent kind of a guy, I include them. And I would say, just roughly, if I had to categorize the number of people in each group of libertarians, I would say it's 10, 30, and 30. 10, 30, 30, and 30. 10 anarcho-capitalists, 10%. 30% for the other 3. So anarcho-capitalists are in a little bit of the minority. Now let me comment on a little bit of what Charles said. He said, you own yourself. Well, magnificent. I think he's being converted to Rothbardianism because only Rothbard would say you own yourself and be consistent about it. Ayn Rand wouldn't, Ron Paul wouldn't, certainly Milton Friedman wouldn't. You own yourself means you can't is my time up?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I'll get him more later.
Oh, the mic. So now we're going to go I mean, you get 10 touched on it.
10 minutes on
Okay, now those were the opening statements, and now we're going to elaborate on libertarianism, and Charles Peralo will begin.
Well, I'm being told that I'm being converted to Rothbardism, but I've been just told that there's a live stream going on, and the comments say I have a bowl cut. So I'm tempted to wear in Batman's hat right now that says "Make America Great Again" to hide my hair. So maybe I'm being converted to something else. So there's a couple interesting points here I'd like to just go down. Regarding anarcho-capitalism, I don't normally associate that much with libertarianism. I think the issue with anarcho-capitalism is anarchy is anarchy, libertarianism is libertarianism. Libertarianism is the view you own yourself and you own your own property, and there is this thing called the non-aggression principle, but there's this belief in that government will be the thing to be allowed to have some aggression to prevent aggression, and there are many schools on that. There's privatization there. But regarding anarcho-capitalism, my issue with it really just stems from the fact that I don't think it'll work. I look at anarcho-capitalism and I say, okay, the 13th century, Scotland, there was, I believe, a society in Scotland where you were given 35 tribes that you were allowed to live in, and of those 35 tribes, basically you decided, and it's a different model for government. That deteriorated with trade and so on, where other nations came in and they had to form a formal defense. So on a foreign policy perspective, for anarcho-capitalism to work, it would really not, I think the best way to say this would really not be effective in a global environment where other people are not anarcho-capitalist. And the next thing with anarcho-capitalism is that of these 35 societies, I feel where it just creates a situation where people are going to hire a government. Government is going to act as something that works with almost a religion and less of something the government that gets represented by land. And I look at that and I just don't see a model there that works. I see a model where confusion that is going to happen. Now, could government end? Bitcoin? I think Bitcoin has the opportunity to end government control of monetary policy. I look at drones and I say, what if we could, in our phones, push a button and as easily as using Uber, get a drone security, basically ending the need for public police. I look at 3D printing and molecular printing and say, you know what, if you want your heroin, it'll be printed. If you want your cancer medication the FDA is denying you from, that can be printed. I look at 3D printing and say, if you want your AK-47, it can be printed. So I do think there is a chance where government could be replaced by technology, but I don't view that as much of a political front. Now, we're looking at libertarianism and the three other tiers he named. So, minarchism, that probably is where I think the definite ends of libertarianism exist, and I think that's the ideal ends. In minarchism, Medicare doesn't exist. Social Security doesn't exist. The government would probably go from hiring maybe, I believe they hire now 14 million people, to probably just defense and probably a greatly reduced defense, so maybe 400,000 people. So going from 14 million to 400,000 is what we discuss. And I believe from that front, probably skip constitutionalism. Constitutionalism has this front where you're going to talk about the state, you're going to talk about local governments. I would say go to a local town hall meeting. It's probably the biggest corruption of government that makes Washington, D.C. look effective. It's a disaster zone. So I look at that and say skip constitutionalism. Let's go from pragmatism, classical liberalism, and then go to minarchism. So doing that, you have to go from 14 million to 400,000. You have to go from 2 million people into jail to about 200,000 people in jail. You have to go from the government spending $4 trillion a year just on the federal level to probably about $500 billion. That's not easy, and that takes pragmatic thought and principle right there. So how does that get handled? I'm going to say a method that we're not seeing in the liberty movement so far, and the method does not have Make America Great Again in it. It's not a method where you say you're going to sacrifice your views on libertarianism, say, oh, because Trump is better on foreign policy, arguably, we're going to embrace anti-trade views, we're going to embrace deporting 20 million people. I'm going to say the answer is embrace Bill Weld, embrace Gary Johnson, embrace a view where you're going to say, we're going to try and cut the government 15%, we're going to try and cut it 20%. And I look at the 4 libertarians who've run in the last year who had online following. The first was Rand Paul, who I support him. Rand Paul said we were going to balance the budget over a course of 5 years. That implied he was going to cut the government about 5% and let tax revenue grow, the economy grow another 5% or 15%, and that works. Then the next libertarian was Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson came out originally in 2012 saying he wanted to cut the government 43%, then he dropped it to 25%, and that became the Johnson-Weld campaign right there. Then there was Austin Peterson, who supported the Penny Plan, who ran this year. I think because Liberty Hangout is the one streaming this, many of his friends are going to be commenting on that, but hello, Austin. And the next is John McAfee, who, when I interviewed McAfee, actually with Liberty Hangout a year ago, he was the one who I thought had the best plan to cut government, which was hire people, which was basically keep paying people and telling them not to work, go find other jobs. So that approach, it sounds a little crazy, but what sounds crazier, giving people money for the next 5 years to go out and do other things, or going out and just firing them flat out and having them riot and burn things down in a way that would make Ferguson, Berkeley, or whatever crisis you're talking about look like nothing. So there's just this method here, and I see libertarianism, personal property. Of course we own ourselves. And in that responsibility, I think we agree on a government, we agree on a piece of land that is going to have a representation, and the ideal representation of that is force to end force. I believe that is libertarianism. But then there's this whole process where I feel like we're bashing people, and one thing is I feel like Dr. Block does wrong, and I think a lot of libertarians do wrong, is being more libertarian than someone does not make you better than they are. I feel like we have this situation where it's like, oh, you're that libertarian? Well, guess what? Not only do I favor privatizing the roads, but I'm going to own the roads, or something silly like that. And it's like, and I feel like there's this score count, like I'm more capitalist, and the liberals do it, the conservatives do it, but the libertarians have hit that to the extreme. They've gone nuts with that, and I just think that is our problem right there. So I don't think that there's much more to talk about on this subject. Libertarianism is indeed personal responsibility. It is the NAP, but it's just how do you apply the NAP? And I think that is from some form of a government. And I think anarcho-capitalism is anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism is libertarianism. And I hope I gave you some fuel for the fire in your segment. Well, let's see.
There's a joke. There was a green car and a red car, and they were in front of the judge, and the green car guy said, "The red car hit me." And the judge said, "Yes, you're right." Then the red car guy got up and said, "The green car hit me." And the judge said, "Yes, you're right." And then somebody from the courtroom said, how can you say that? First you say the green car is innocent, then you say the red car is innocent. It can't be both. And you know what the judge says? You're right also. The point is, if you commit a self-contradiction, it's sort of a problem. Logical consistency is sort of I wouldn't say the be-all and end-all of everything, but it's the necessary condition, and yet Mr. Peralo is contradicting himself all over the place. He says that we should have aggression to prevent aggression. Well, come on. I mean, if you're against initiatory aggression and you stop initiatory aggression by initiating aggression, you're contradicting yourself. I mean, it's sort of hard to argue with people who contradict themselves because, pretty soon they'll say A is not A or 2 + 2 is not 4 or something. It's very difficult. Then he says, we'll use force to end force. Come on. I mean, if you're against initiatory force, you can't use initiatory force to end initiatory force. Then he reiterates you own yourself. Now, here he's magnificent. This is the essence of libertarianism. You own yourself, and this is therefore we agree on government. Wow, that's pretty fast. It went right by me. I own myself means you can't grab me or my property without my permission. And you come along with a gun, and you're the IRS, and you say, hey, we need $500 billion that he supports. And, I'm willing to call this libertarianism, but sort of just by being a nice guy. In my heart of hearts, the only consistent libertarians are the anarcho-capitalists. Whereas the way he sees it, the only consistent libertarians are the minarchists, maybe the constitutionalists, and the classical liberals. No, it's the very opposite. The only consistent libertarians are anarcho-capitalists. Now look, we did have this thing called the Dallas Accord. The Dallas Accord was created in the LP because the anarchists and libertarians were fighting with each other. And what they said is, look, first let's reduce government by down to 5% or 10% of what it is, and then we'll fight. And so within the LP, I think that's a good idea for the LP, that we all work together. But this is not the LP, although I support the LP. This is a philosophical discussion. And on this philosophical discussion, I say, the only logical, consistent libertarian, if you agree that you own yourself, and he says that you own yourself, and he repeated it a second time, and then he contradicts himself by supporting government. You can't have it both ways. You can't say the green car is right and the red car is right, and that the judge who says that both are right is also right. That's just a blatant contradiction. He says that libertarianism isn't doing too well. I was converted by Ayn Rand in 1963 to libertarianism, and then I was converted by Murray Rothbard in 1966 to anarchism, free market anarchism. And I asked Murray, how many libertarians are there in the world? This is 1966. And he said 25. Well, we've got more than 25 people in this small group. The gays say we are everywhere. We libertarians, we're everywhere. So in one sense, I agree with Mr. Peralo. We're not doing too well. We haven't formed the government. God forbid, but what the heck. We're not a power in the land. The Libertarian Party gets 1 or 3% of the vote, and only 3 because the 2 candidates, Hillary and Donald, were so reviled by everyone. The usual Libertarian vote is about 1%. So in some sense, we're not doing too well, and in another sense, we're doing very, very well. And, if you're an optimist or a pessimist, you can see the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. Taxes are coercive. Taxes are a violation of the non-aggression principle. Taxes are a violation of the idea that you own yourself. If you really own yourself and somebody comes along and says you have to... Am I out of time already?
10 minutes? 10 minutes?
That was 10 minutes?
I don't think that was 10 minutes.
Oh, sorry, I made a bit of a mistake. Sorry.
I'm waiting for you to say taxation instead.
What about that $100 I gave you to let me speak? Give me my 100 back.
We're gonna fire our timekeeper.
Okay, fire him, or tell him to give me extra time or something. I don't know. Taxes are coercive. Taxes are a necessary concomitant of government, and if you favor taxes, you can't say with a straight face that you own yourself, unless you contemplate self-contradiction. Look, Mr. Peralo says that it wouldn't work. Well, right now there's a state of anarchy between countries. Canada and Chile are in a state of anarchy with each other. Namely, there's no world government. Burundi and Brazil are in a state of anarchy with each other. Every other country is in a state of anarchy with every other country. So if you say it can't work, what you're really saying is we need world government. Well, world government is a problem. I mean, if we had a democratic world government, China and India, between them, would pretty much run things. And nobody really likes that. I'm Jewish. We Jews keep running away from different people. There'd be no place to run. I mean, Mars is not yet habitable, although maybe we'll get there. But I think it's working fine, anarchy between countries. Now, the whole idea is that if we didn't have a government, Lewis and I might get into a fight, and therefore we need a government to make sure that Lewis and I behave. Well, on that logic, we need a world government to make sure Chile and Canada don't get into a fight. Notice my beautiful alliteration: China, Chile, Burundi, Brazil. Isn't that great? Another point is secession. Look, we have a thing called free association. Recently, there was a florist and a photographer and a baker, and a gay couple went to each of them and said, "Hey, we're having a wedding. Please, serve as our photographer or as our florist or as our baker." And they said, "No, we're Christians and we don't really want to do that." And they were going to put him in jail almost. They fined the baker $130,000. That's a violation of free association. And this is a strong part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which lefties favored and people who call themselves libertarians favored, and Mr. Peralo favors. And this is a violation of the law of free association. Compelling people to associate with one another against their will is a blatant violation of libertarian philosophy. He says we should hire a government. Yes, we should hire a government. But that means we should agree to it. And if we agree to it, it couldn't be called government, because government is the thing that you don't agree to. We need another word. It's called private defense agencies. Yes, I agree. Let's hire a private defense agency. Let's hire a court. Let's hire people. All action should be voluntary. No one should coerce anyone else. And yet this man stands there and tells us that you own yourself, and yet he favors all this sort of stuff. This is a philosophical monstrosity. Yes, he says that technology and Bitcoin might get rid of the FDA, might get rid of the Fed or whatever it is. Well, fine, but he's contradicting himself again. He keeps contradicting himself. And I've got a few other examples, because he wrote these things that Lewis mentioned. Something libertarians must admit, Murray Rothbard sucked. A very elegant way of putting matters. I have these things in front of me, and he's roughly the age of my students, a little older, but I'm a professor, and I have term papers, and I'm sort of looking at this stuff as if it was a term paper, and I'm trying to think of, what grade would I give it? And I tell you, I would give it an A++ for courage. He is a magnificently courageous young man, and I applaud him for that. He comes to this group, which is the Rothbardian Circle. He writes this stuff, which, a lot of libertarians revere Murray Rothbard, so I give him an A+ for courage. But you can't have self-contradictions. For example, he says over here, a libertarian such as my mega superhero Ron Paul. Mega superhero Ron Paul. And then on another page, guess what he says about my man Ron? He says that, where is it? Here it is. Really, Ron Paul, why do all libertarians seem to have a scam cash for gold business?
Yeah.
Sort of denigrating this superhero of his. And then he said, I've met at least over a dozen libertarians who are literally watching these joke podcasts. So he's saying that Ron Paul is guilty of joke podcast? After saying that Ron Paul is, let me repeat that, mega superhero.
Yeah.
And then what does he say? That one more contradiction. The age of Ron Paul is dead, and he's exulting in this. He's not reporting this. So he's contradicting himself with Ron Paul, and he also does the same thing with Tom Woods. What does he do with Tom Woods? He says, Tom, I actually do like Tom Woods. And then what does he say about Tom Woods? He says that Tom Woods is a joke, and Tom Woods was criticizing his screed. And he says, I've met at least 2 dozen libertarians who are literally watching these joke podcasts from Tom Woods, Peter Schiff, and Ron Paul. So again, he's contradicting himself. And if this was a term paper from a student of mine, I'd say, hey, look, you can't say that the green car was right and that the red car was right and that the judge who said both are right is also right. You have to make up your bloody mind. You just can't be all over the lot. And this is just, one little, 2 little essays that he wrote, and there are just contradictions all over the place. But again, these are minor contradictions. The major contradiction, the major philosophical contradiction of Mr. Peralo is he says you own yourself, and he repeats you own yourself, and then he favors government, which is the antithesis of you owning yourself. You can't own yourself if somebody can pull a gun on you with legitimacy, namely they run the law, they have all the guns. Well, not all the guns, but they have the bigger guns, and they violate our rights. So how can you say that you own yourself? Yes, we should hire a government, that's the key, but everything else he says contradicts that. So it's hard, it's sort of like nailing jelly to a tree or something. How do you debate someone who says this and then he says the very opposite of it? What does he mean? He's got to stick to something, otherwise he's not going to be a good target. And I want to be a good target because I want to convert him to the one true faith of Murray Rothbardianism, because I'm a Rothbardian, and I think Rothbardianism is the only legitimate viewpoint. Now, he says that Murray is a cult leader. Ayn Rand was a cult leader. Ayn Rand converted me to libertarianism. I'd go to the NBI, the Nathaniel Branden Institute. He also was instrumental in converting me to libertarianism. And if you asked Ayn Rand a question like, well, on page 433 of Atlas Shrugged, you said this. Could you please elaborate on it? That would be a good question, and she would answer it, and everything would be hokey-dokey or okay or whatever. But if you said, on page 432 you said this, and on page 802 you said that, and I see a contradiction, you know what she would do? She would say, get out. And she would be serious. I mean, sometimes I say get out, but I'm not serious. This is a cult, where you're off the mailing list, and you're damned to hell or whatever it is. This is very cult-like, whereas Murray Rothbard was very different. I have disagreed with Murray on 4 or 5 things, and over the years, and he never told me to get out of his living room. He never broke with me. He never said, never darken my doorstep again. One of the things was immigration. I disagree with him on immigration. Another thing was voluntary slavery. The idea here is my son has a dread disease, and it'll cost $5 million to fix him up, but I don't have $5 million, and you guys have all wanted me to be your slave for many years. I'll write a Defending the Undefendable 3 for you, whatever it is you want. I'll pick cotton on your plantation. And you give me the $5 million, I give the $5 million to my son's doctors, and then I become your slave. We both gain because in free enterprise, all parties to every interaction gain in the ex ante sense, namely, I value my son's life more than my freedom. You value my servitude more than the $5 million, so there's mutual gain. Did Murray agree with that? No, Murray disagreed. And he didn't say get out, he didn't toss me away. I was his associate editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. I was his lifelong friend, or my own, well, not lifelong, but many years friend. So to say that Murray was a cult leader and that Ayn Rand wasn't is sort of a perversion of the worst sort. I disagreed with Murray on several other points, technical points, and to say that Murray didn't just treat me this way. Murray had many followers, and Murray used to say, every dog gets one bite, or when he was in his more generous mood, every dog gets 5 bites. Namely, if you deviate from libertarianism on this or that, heck, you're still a libertarian. Whereas with Ayn Rand, if you disagree with one iota or one syllable of anything in objectivism, and then he, toward the end of his screed, he points out positively this cultist, what's his name? Yaron Brook, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Yaron Brook, and he says this guy is a great guy. Well, this guy is a cultist. He says the new age of philosophers exists with the people working on the Ayn Rand Institute under the leadership of Yaron Brook. This guy is a cultist. This guy, you disagree with one comma of what Ayn Rand said anywhere, and you're out. So here again, he's contradicting himself. Well, not exactly a logical contradiction, but the point is, he's inverting the truth. The truth is that Murray Rothbard was friends with all sorts of people, and people that disagreed with him. And Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden and Leonard Peikoff and Yaron Brook and all those guys, the word cultist was made for those people. I mean, that's the paradigm example of a cultist. And he says, well, these guys are okay, and Murray Rothbard's a cultist. Now, let me give you a few examples because Mr. Peralo says that Murray was stupid, or I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he denigrated Murray for making political alliances. And he said Murray never compromised. Murray compromised all over the place. Look, when there were 25 libertarians in the world, and Murray had about 10 followers of his, people like Ralph Raico, who recently passed away, Leonard Liggio, Ron Hamaway. These people were all 4 or 5 years older than me. I was in sort of the second generation of the Circle Bastiat, which was Murray's group. What Murray would do is make alliances, sometimes with the left and sometimes with the right. Why? Because he wanted to have more power than he had with the very, very few numbers that he had. So I remember I was part of the Peace and Freedom movement. And the Peace and Freedom movement had the Trotskyites, about 300, and the Progressive Labor, the Maoists, 100, and we, about 10 of us. And he doesn't agree with the Maoists. He doesn't agree with the Progressive Labor. Murray is a bitter opponent of them, but he's willing to compromise with them. And then he would make alliances on the right with David Duke or with other people, Strom Thurmond, Buchanan, all of which really exercises Mr. Peralo and says, well, he's an idiot, Murray's an idiot because he's doing this. What Murray was doing was trying to get a bigger megaphone, to try to amplify his power. He tried to promote liberty in many ways, by writing books, by writing articles, by giving speeches, and also by political activism. So you can't say that Murray never compromised, because he's compromising with people way over on the left, Maoists and socialists, and people way over on the right, the conservatives and the other weirdos. And Murray is doing this in order to promote libertarianism. That's why I agreed to debate Mr. Peralo, because I want to convert him to libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism. I want to convert him to Rothbardianism, just like Murray wanted to convert Progressive Labor. Look, I'll go to the devil himself and try to convert him to libertarianism. And there's nothing wrong with that. And to say that Murray was a jerk or an idiot, these are my words, I don't remember the exact words he used, but he's denigrating Murray Rothbard for making alliances with all sorts of people that Murray doesn't agree with, and then he accuses him of being intolerant and uncompromising. Well, you can't have it both ways. On the one hand, he says he's intolerant and non-compromising. On the other side, he says that Murray is a jerk for making alliances with people like Strom Thurmond or whoever else is in his article. You can't have it both ways. The red car, the blue car, the green car, they're all right. It's very difficult to argue with a person who is so irrational.
I'm just going to say that he went over time. So we lost track of time on that. As you're probably wondering why he went on for so long. But it was great stuff. And Charles, you're welcome to do the same.
Before I start, can I get a show of hands here? People committed to not breaking the nap about what I'm going to say. Can we get some hands here? I'm not seeing some hands from that. That guy's not going to be hand right there. Okay. So it was nice being told I have the political views of jelly right there. So let's first off, I think, start with what I said about Ron Paul. Well, as we all know, my mega superheroes, I view it's very easy for me to call someone a mega superhero, as we can clearly see. But when it comes to Ron Paul, I would say the difference in what I meant from the article there is candidate Ron Paul versus current Ron Paul, where to get an endorsement out of him in the Liberty Movement is, well, what are we going to have to pay for? And then I look at it and I say...
Can't be heard anymore.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
they're like static. I think when he's close.
Always microphone issues. How about now?
Yeah.
All right, we're good?
Yeah.
Good.
Sorry for the interruption. I was trying to help you.
No. That is the good interruption, not the Nick Gillespie interruption. We know that. No, so right there with everything with the Ron Paul thing, Ron Paul in 2012, I was a huge fan of. I still am. But my issue with Ron Paul really stems from when I see these podcasts and I see him promote, like, buy gold in commercial breaks to the Rush Limbaugh show. That's my issue there, because what I bring up to Tom Woods and I bring up to Peter Schiff and I bring up to a lot of libertarians is we make these claims, which are good, some of them are great claims, but then we say things which are just not the truth. Like, for example, one claim which has been going around is Austrian economists for years have predicted every financial collapse. And, well, I would say the best line I've ever heard came from Steve Horwitz at an event, I believe in November of this year, of 2016, and I asked him, what do you think of Peter Schiff's claim that he predicted the 2008 recession, but it seems like on his show he predicts a recession is going to happen every year, and his line was, well, Peter Schiff has predicted 20 of the last 4 recessions. And I look at that and I say, Peter Schiff owns a gold company. Ron Paul represents a gold company. Glenn Beck, who's pro-gold standard, and Glenn Beck's probably not the best example to bring to this crowd, but, he owns a gold company as well. So we have this issue where I think these people who say these great things are, to some extent, overstating them, and then they talk about gold. So when I bash the podcast, and regarding Tom Woods, I'm going to say maybe I went a little harsh on Tom Woods, but, it got a response out of him, and it got quite a few to achieve that goal. And regarding Tom Woods as a whole, though, I think that he's part of the problem with the Liberty Movement to some extent in the no-compromise approach. We talk about Tom Woods. I remember in 2012, I was so happy I saw him go out for Ron Paul, like, woo, Ron Paul, he's the best. But then in 2016, Rand Paul runs around. Rand Paul advocates, I would say, a very good libertarian platform, something that could actually get approved through the Senate. And what do we see? I don't see Tom Woods running out to support him. I see maybe 1 or 2 podcasts where he vaguely mentions the good about him, and I see Lou Rockwell come out and formally try and say Trump is the best, we should perhaps support Trump over Rand. And it seems to be more of, a lot of libertarians, I think, they would rather align with the guy who doesn't claim to be libertarian-ish but has maybe a couple views they agree with, over someone who claims to be libertarian and is more libertarian but not as libertarian as they are. And it gets into this point that I've brought up a million times, where being libertarian, more libertarian than someone, does not make you get a higher score count. It's not a score in video games, it's not an achievement. So that's what I'm getting at with the Ron Paul and the Woods thing. And once again, because everyone but that guy has raised hands to not breaking the nap over what I'm going to say on Rothbard, my issue with Murray Rothbard is, I would say the big difference between Milton Friedman and Murray Rothbard is this. Milton Friedman was a libertarian first and a pragmatist second. Murray Rothbard, I would say, was a contrarian first, a libertarian second. And what I mean by that is, who is the first person that Murray Rothbard endorsed? The first one he endorsed was a man named Strom Thurmond. And that is not alliance building. Alliance building is Robert Taft. Alliance building from that era would probably be some more people who were aligned in that school. It would be maybe even Hubert Humphrey in the 1940s when he wasn't so LBJ-like. So there were some better people to make alliances with, but the first person we make alliances with are a Democrat from the South who is fiscally not a conservative, and socially, Jim Coe's okay. And the final person Murray Rothbard endorsed, well, it was actually Ross Perot, but the second to final was a man named David Duke. David Duke is a Holocaust denier. David Duke has advocated like the Back to Africa movement 100 years post-slavery. David Duke is one of the strangest and most shameful characters, and Rothbard did endorse him. He did try and build that alliance. So I look at my Rothbard bashing, and I'm not calling him an idiot as a whole. Murray Rothbard went to Columbia. Murray Rothbard was a PhD. He's not a dumb guy. But politically, I'm just going to say in terms of how he strategized things, maybe he was not the brightest person. Maybe Murray Rothbard approached things from a point of view where, you know what, he had a sound view on economics, sound view on social policy, pretty damn good view on foreign policy, and he had this ideal for the government, but there's sort of this issue I feel with the libertarian community where it's like if we have to get into a room with someone like Jeff Flake or Bill Weld or Lisa Murkowski, we can't do it, but we feel more comfortable with someone like, I don't know, who's a modern racist sort of person? Actually, Donald Trump. I mean, that might be a good example right there. Okay, that was a little cruel. That was a little cruel to our dear president, but the wall thing, the deportations, the campaign Donald Trump, the president doesn't seem that bad. But I just look at it and I see that we like to make alliances which are just very bizarre. Now, the next thing is I want to get into, because you covered a lot right there. Got into a lot of stuff. Government should, now, you own yourself. How does a government work in that? And like I said, I went back to 13th century Scotland, something I'm sure we've all spent nights and not been able to go to sleep over. 13th century Scotland. And I look at that and I say that was probably the most clear-cut example in history of anarchy existed to the form that you'd pick a government, and you could pretty much pick no government and it would work. But the model only lasted for, I believe, 20 years, and rape was okay, murder happened a lot, and this stuff was happening all over the world and no one cared, but there was no real efficiency here. And I look at it and I say that if you have to interact, where you're going to say, I'm going to join the Charles Peralo company of services, or I'm going to join the Walter Block services, and you get to a point where people are just picking, in the Charles Peralo services, X is legal, but in the Walter Block services, it's not. You get to this point where how do you interact on that front? The complexities there, the punishments. It just gets to a point where you take decentralization, which is a good idea in most cases, but then you enter a very weird extreme to it all. And when it comes to anarchy, I just don't count, I view the NAP as government existent. You own yourself, but there is a sacrifice we make in living in a mutual society where when you leave, and you can leave that society. I think one of the greatest people who spoke on this issue is actually Peter Thiel. And he said the thing that all governments should not do is make it hard for you to leave. That's fair. If you want to go out and live in the woods, I call that anarchy to some extent. But living in a society where 80-90% of people are going to agree to something, and reality is I think most of the world, 99% of the people do agree with having a government in some form. We talk about this election with Trump versus Hillary, and I'll include versus Gary, because I liked Gary quite a bit. I don't think many people knew who he was, but I liked him. And I just look at it, and I say, you know what, we have people cry over Donald Trump, but would they actually give up government? 99% of them probably wouldn't. If Hillary Clinton would have won, we would have had people cry. I bet you 99% of Trump supporters would have said, let's keep the government. So I think there is a volunteerism to the current state of things. And if there wasn't, we would probably have anarchy. So I'm just reviewing the situation, and I don't think there is a merge of principles, because I think anarchy will lead to force, anarchy will lead to government, minarchy will not. Minarchy, I think that we had the Constitution for 100 years where we had borderline minarchy, some obvious problems, but something close, a close cousin, and it lasted a century. And it created the most prosperous society in all of history. We go to Renaissance era governments, obviously some flaws there, but for the most part there was a social and fiscal freedom. There was a lot of growth. It was called the Renaissance. So I think just creating some sort of stable government and continuing to adjust with it, that is the best bet. And this goes to the point of Milton Friedman and how he handled things. Milton Friedman, with his career, not a lot of people have been drafted recently. Milton Friedman went out to Congress, he debated generals, he talked to Richard Nixon, had meetings with them, things Murray Rothbard could have done. We don't have a draft anymore, at least to some extent, and that was largely due to Friedman. Let's go look at school choice in Denmark, Chile, Hong Kong. He went and met with all those people, and he did deal with some people who were definitely anti-libertarian, and he accomplished a lot more. So when it comes to Murray Rothbard, I accept the idea that he might have tried to reach out to other people, but the people were just probably not the best people to align with. So I think that that's the core point here. But, I mean, when it comes to calling Murray Rothbard an idiot, I don't. He's clearly a smart man, but politically, he's a bit of an idiot. I mean, but here's the thing. I mean, Dr. Block, can you speak Chinese? So you're an idiot that's speaking Chinese, but you're an A+ as an economist. So I think this goes into the intellectuals in society right here. Thomas Sowell. Rothbard was an intellectual on economics, not so much of an intellectual on political discourse and how to move on that. And I think that sting has hurt the liberty movement going forward. But I think I spoke enough on this topic, and you over there, I see no harpoon stabbed at me. You did not break the nap. Good job. Lewis, here.
Oh, go ahead and give it to Walter.
I had a list of areas where I disagree with Murray, and Murray never booted me out of any movement. I mentioned voluntary slavery, and I mentioned immigration. Also, I disagree with him on Israel. I disagree with him on evictionism and pro-choice. He was pro-choice. I'm an evictionist on the abortion issue. And the Hayek triangle. Murray was a big fan of the Hayekian triangle in Austrian economics. I disagreed with him on that as well. An economist was once asked, "How is your wife?" The answer was,
Compared to what?
he was a student of mine, so he knows. Compared to what? Strom Thurmond, compared to what? David Duke, compared to what? I mean, there are worse people than David Duke.
In government.
There are worse people all over the place. I mean, you have to say worse than what? Or Donald Trump. I started this group called Libertarians for Donald Trump, and also Scholars for Donald Trump. I did it with a few colleagues. And compared to Hillary. I mean, Donald said he can get along with Putin. Hillary said Putin is a Hitler. Donald said we never should have gone into Libya and got Gaddafi. We never should have gone in Iraq. And now we're going to go into Iran or other countries. Hillary is a warmonger. Hillary wanted to have a no-fly zone over Syria. Guess who's flying planes over Syria? Russia. Hillary loves NATO. NATO is sweeping eastward. They're having war games right on Russia's front door. Donald says he can get along with her. Now, Donald's a little weak on a lot of things. Certainly on foreign trade, I don't agree with him. No libertarian would agree with him on that. But compared to Hillary, Hillary was worse. My own counsel was in a red state where Donald is going to win, or in a blue state where Hillary is going to win, vote for Gary Johnson. But in a purple state where you're not sure who's going to win, Donald or Hillary, then vote for Donald. Sorry, I said that wrong. In a red or a blue state, vote for Gary Johnson. In a purple state, vote for Trump. And there are only 5 or 6 purple states. So I was trying to have my cake and eat it, trying to support both. On racism, the left is always saying you're a racist. There are 2 types of racism. One is you hate black people, or whatever the minority group is, and you want to undermine them. You favor the minimum wage because it'll unemploy unskilled black young kids. That's a very bad kind of racism. And I don't think any libertarian can be racist in that sense. But in another sense, we're all racist now. There's a guy who wrote a book, White Men Can't Jump. White men can't jump. I mean, compared to black men. LeBron James got springs in his legs. He can jump 40 feet in the air. I'm exaggerating a little bit. On the other hand, black men can't swim. And it's not because they weren't allowed in the pool. They've been allowed in the pool for the last 40 years. 80 years ago, they weren't allowed in the pool, but they've been allowed in the pool. Look at the Olympics and look who's in the finals of the swimming tournament. They can't swim because their body weight is too heavy or something. I'm not sure exactly why, but I know they can't swim.
Bone density.
Now, to say these things are truths, and yet you need, on college campuses now, I'm a professor at Loyola University, and by the way, out there in Radio Land, come study with me if you want Austro-Libertarian economics, not just me. I've got 8 or 9 colleagues. We have about 10 Austro-Libertarian professors at Loyola, and only 300 professors, so we outnumber them. That was a joke. In most places, not one single Libertarian or Austrian, and we've got 3%, 10 out of 300. So come on by. What was I talking about? Something. Lost my train of thought.
My bad.
No, I'll keep it for a second.
Wait, you're talking about how I was great.
How black men can't swim.
Oh, right. Yeah, racism. Right. That kind of racism is just telling the truth about things. And yet, if you favor telling the truth about things, and you don't want to give a trigger warning, and you don't want to give a safe space, and you don't want to be a snowflake or whatever it is, somehow you're seen as a racist. The left is always calling the right and libertarians racist, and I fear that Mr. Peralo is now calling Murray Rothbard a racist. Murray Rothbard opposed the minimum wage, and he knew that the main victims of the minimum wage were young black kids who couldn't get a job. Before the advent of the minimum wage, the unemployment rate of whites and blacks and young and old was about the same. After, young black kids have got a quadruple unemployment rate of older white people, middle-aged people. Is my time up now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, we've kind of touched a little bit upon Murray Rothbard, but that is our next segment. We started with libertarianism. So here comes Charles Peralo to talk about Murray Rothbard.
I'm just going to assume the show of hands from before on people promising not to break the nap continued. Okay, so there's a couple of points there I want to bring up that Dr. Block mentioned. So it really comes, I think, a big question into this idea of racism. When it comes to Murray Rothbard, I actually did sort of, in my articles on that, say, Murray Rothbard kind of did the racist thing, but am I really calling a man who grew up in Brooklyn as a Jewish man in the 30s and 40s a racist? No, not really. But when you go out and support so many people like that, because let's face it, Strom Thurmond even said in his final, as he left the Senate, he said, "I walked into here a racist." This is not the left calling Strom Thurmond a racist. This is him calling himself a racist, and he said he was a racist up until probably the 70s. You look at David Duke. I'm sorry, David Duke, that is not a bunch of little PC people complaining about Milo Yiannopoulos. David Duke's a racist. I mean, David Duke, actually, if you look at his debate with Alex Jones, of all people, if anyone's ever followed anything I've written, for me to say Alex Jones was ever the voice of reason in any discussion, then that's really just the discussion to have it on. But I look at the David Duke, Alex Jones debate, and some lines from David Duke. The Holocaust did not happen. We need to have segregated schools again. And he's not talking about the bone density or who can swim. I mean, these are just outright supremacist points on him. So with Murray Rothbard, I don't want someone who is revered as, I don't want a great economist or someone who's very intelligent to be viewed as a racist. But when there's political alliances like that, and libertarians go out and make their profile pictures on Facebook, a Rothbard photo, or they go out and wear a Rothbard t-shirt, and you say, well, that guy supported Duke, that guy supported Thurmond, it does make it harder. And it is an issue that you kind of have to apologize for. I mean, even the left, to some extent, right now, they're coming out and saying, FDR did something wrong, Woodrow Wilson did something wrong. So there are problems here you have to recover on. Now, with Murray Rothbard, I think he did a lot of good stuff, actually. I think the Libertarian Party would not have had the same foundations it did have without Rothbard. I think, to some extent, the radicalization of some people keeps them into the movement. It does keep them interested. It does keep them engaged. So that is an important part to have that wing. And the other thing I'll actually truly value Rothbard on, although Dr. Block mentioned he disagrees with him on Israel, which so do I to some extent, I think having a very pro-Palestinian voice is a good thing. I think having a Jewish man go up and say Israel's foundations are probably wrong and Palestine's a good thing. So I don't think he's a racist, and I don't think he's a dumb man. But I look at this and I just say that politically, we can call, like I said I like Ron Paul, but I said Ron Paul has a lot of flaws. I like Gary Johnson a lot. Gary Johnson, when it came to that Aleppo thing, was the biggest disaster I've ever seen on some fronts. So we can call people we worship and say they have mistakes, and then we have to kind of recover from that. And that's all I'm saying the liberty movement really does with Rothbard. I come off as harsh, but here's the thing. If you were to go on, if there was a presidential debate that were to happen, and you say, I'm influenced by Murray Rothbard, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, or for God's sakes, you can get Martin O'Malley up there, of all people, if you remember that guy, and he would be able, you can get Lincoln Chafee to be able, or Jeb Bush could be able to rip you apart on that, on the Rothbard front. So there just needs to be a clear way to handle this. But I look at Rothbard and I see that as a big issue. And you bring up the point with Donald Trump, which you talked about recently. And I say with Trump, and you look at the options. With Strom Thurmond, he ran against some people originally who were Republicans, who actually were very, very pro-states' rights. And they were definitely more Nelson Rockefeller people, but I would say they were better than Strom Thurmond. And you look at David Duke, and I forgot the name of the man who Duke lost against in 1991. That guy served 10 years in prison, and currently he has a 31-year-old wife, despite being 85 years old, and has a kid with her. Edwin Edwards. And so Edwin Edwards versus David Duke, that's not the best decision, but sometimes I think if you're going to form an alliance, I would probably say Edwin Edwards, despite being a criminal, is still better than Duke. And looking at it, you know, I would say probably fold, don't support either one, take your beating no matter how much it is. I mean, Walter Block in his debate with Nixon Gillespie, he said, if you have to choose a master, pick the one that's going to beat you once a month and not once a week. To some extent, when it's that bad, I'd say just take death at that point. And I think that Edwin Edwards versus David Duke, there's no alliance to be made at that point. So that's really just my issue with Rothbard in a nutshell. I think I have some problems with the Austrian school where I think they oversimplify things largely on the Peter Schiff front. But I look at Rothbard and I say that here's someone who advocates a lot of things, and in some cases very well. I think if you look at Tom Woods and you look at Murray Rothbard, the way they talk about the Depression of 1920, if you were to talk about like some things that President Polk did, on history they're very good. But I feel like there's almost this issue where they have this history in front of them. The economics is maybe a little bit dodgy in some places, but then you enter this political world where it's, okay, if you're an extremist, we're going to love you. If you're a moderate, we're going to hate you. But if you're an extremist on a couple of minor issues we agree with, we're going to ignore how you're an extremist on things we highly disagree with you with. So that's where my issue with Murray Rothbard stems out. But I do like him on many things. I mean, I like foreign policy. I like how he had the balls to do a lot of things he did. I like him on economics because, you know, he's pretty strong there. I like how he wore bow ties. So there are great things about Murray Rothbard we can talk about, but I'm ready to praise Milton Friedman in our next segment, and I'm going to give a mic to Dr. Block.
Prince Harry once wore a swastika, and everybody and his uncle said, "Oh my God, a swastika, horrible." Every kid on college campus wears a hammer and sickle, and nobody says squat. Now look, both of them are bad. One was a National Socialist, Hitler, and Stalin and Lenin were international socialists. As the former governor of Alabama said, there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. They're both evil. And yet somehow Prince Harry, when he wore a swastika to a party, it was condemned by every right-thinking politically correct person. And when he did and when the kids on college campus wear Che Guevara or what's his name, Cuba dictator? Fidel Castro, that's okay, because they're lefties, so it's okay. But if they're righties, evil righties, I mean, we libertarians are neither of the left nor the right. We're libertarians. Them guys are either lefty or righty. Well, Mr. Peralo is doing the same thing. He keeps talking about David Duke. He never talks about progressive labor or the Trotskyites. Murray made an alliance with progressive labor. Progressive labor is the lefty communist party. Not a word. He doesn't say anything about that. Just David Duke, David Duke, David Duke. David Duke wasn't David Duke when Murray Rothbard tried to make an alliance with him. David Duke, as a younger person, had very, very bad views, racist in the bad sense, but he changed his mind. Murray was trying to convert him, just like I'm trying to convert Mr. Peralo. Look, what you have here is a bias on the left, that the right-wing alliances are no good. He never mentions any left-wing alliances of Murray's and lambastes him for left-wing alliances, but they're evilly obnoxious, and they're equally human beings that we should try to convert. As I said, I would go to the devil himself and try to convert him to libertarianism. And the devil is worse than everybody else because all evil comes from him, I guess. Let me talk about the draft, because Mr. Peralo said that Milton Friedman was really good on the draft. Milton Friedman was horrible on the draft. He was execrable. Why do I say that? Because when did he support ending the draft during the Vietnam War? And why did he support it? Part of it was for freedom, and I take my hat off to him, but part of it was to make the U.S. military more efficient. Now, making the U.S. military more efficient while they're fighting an unjust war is not cool. It's not libertarian. It's not very good. I wrote an article on this in Murray Rothbard's The Libertarian Forum saying exactly this. Saying that if it's evil, we don't want more efficiency. Milton Friedman wanted more efficient U.S. military that were bombing people in Vietnam. Muhammad Ali, a hero of mine, once said that no Vietnamese ever called me the N-word. And he went to jail for it. He lost his heavyweight championship. But no Vietnamese ever called us anything. No Vietnamese ever had anything to do with us, and yet we're bombing the crap out of them. And Milton Friedman is trying to make our bombing the crap out of them more efficient. And we say that that's libertarian? And we brag about that? That's not good. That's not free enterprise. That's the opposite of free enterprise. That is despicable on the part of Milton Friedman. And for Mr. Peralo to support him on that is problematic. Look, I don't favor the draft. Lord knows, no libertarian can favor the draft. But to favor the volunteer military on the grounds that it'll make the U.S. military more efficient while they're doing bad things, and he agrees that they're doing bad things because Mr. Peralo is pretty good. I think he supports the Ron Paul foreign policy. And by the way, I supported Bernie versus Hillary on foreign policy because Bernie was pretty good on foreign policy. Right now we have something like 800 military bases in 130 countries, and they call it defense. You know, I live in New Orleans. We have the Pelicans, and sometimes I go watch them play. And when the other team has the ball, what do the people in the stands yell? Defense, defense. Namely, they can tell the difference between defense and offense. Milton Friedman can't. That, I think, is a much more serious problem than trying to make nice with David Duke and win over him and his followers to libertarianism. That's a very, very serious, horrific sort of a thing. And it's hard to forgive Milton Friedman for that. And it's hard to see how he's good on foreign policy. Murray used to have this aphorism, people specialize in what they're worst in. Now, Milton Friedman was really, really good on the minimum wage, on rent control, on free markets, on government regulations of all sorts, on occupational licensure. He was magnificent. His Chapter 9 in Capitalism and Freedom, where he even applied this to doctors shouldn't be licensed. Magnificent. But does he specialize in any of that? No. What does he specialize in? Money, where he's horrible, and I'll get to that when we talk about economics, and in school vouchers, which, look, suppose restaurants were all run by the government. Restaurants are all run by the government. No McDonald's, no, what's that place we went to last night? Versailles, whatever. None of that. All run by government. And now Milton Friedman comes along and says, well, look, what did the libertarians say? Libertarians say, well, restaurants should be run roughly the way they are now. Except the FDA shouldn't be bothering them, and it should just be private certification agencies making sure that they had cleanliness and all that. But what would Milton Friedman say? He would say, let's have restaurant vouchers. See, right now, you have to go to your local restaurant. And if you live near Versailles, you can go to Versailles, but if you don't, you have to go to McDonald's. That's the analogy of restaurants and school vouchers. And now Milton Friedman is saying, no, government should still run all the restaurants. Oh, yeah. But you should have vouchers. You can go to any restaurant you want. That's freedom. And this is what Milton Friedman specializes in, apart from monetary theory. This is hard to reconcile with libertarianism. Murray Rothbard was sound as a bell on antitrust. Antitrust is a horrendous policy. It's a horrendous law. What it does is if you succeed in business and get bigger and bigger, they sick the antitrust people on you. For a while, IBM was the only one making IBM computers. IBM didn't send out gunmen to any nerd who was trying to compete with them and shoot them. No, IBM was just sitting there in Armonk, New York, near where you live somewhere, and making computers, and the antitrust people were bugging the hell out of them. Guess who supports that? Milton Friedman. Not necessarily that case, but he supports antitrust in general. Whereas, and even Mises supported that. Whereas Murray Rothbard in Man, Economy, and State had a beautiful chapter, I think chapter 12, ripping into shreds this idea of monopoly theory. So on antitrust, Milton Friedman was very bad, and Murray Rothbard was very good. We talked about the volunteer military. Murray Rothbard saw this point. You don't want to make evil more efficient. Look, let's take the Nazi concentration camps. What would Murray Rothbard's view be on the Nazi concentration camps? End them. Why? Because they're coercive. What would Milton Friedman's view be? Oh, by the way, the Nazi concentration camp guards are drafted, and some of them don't like their jobs because it's yucky, you have to kill innocent people, and they're very inefficient, they sort of don't really want to kill people because they're drafted into it. Milton Friedman would say, let's have a voluntary torturary. Namely, we should only get concentration camp guards who love their jobs and want to do a good job. That would be the analog. The negative income tax. Negative income tax. I mean, Murray Rothbard never met a tax that he liked. Taxes for him were no different than a hold-up man coming up to you with a gun and saying, give me your hat, give me that MAGA hat, or I'll shoot you. It's the same thing. Milton Friedman favored the, tax withholding. Now, to be fair to Milton, he later apologized for it, 50 years later. But what the heck, who's keeping count? Who's keeping count of time? It took him 50 years to apologize for this. Murray Rothbard never had to apologize for anything like that. The withholding tax makes taxes easier. If you have to pay everything on April 15th, you're going to say, my God, they took 30, 40% of my income. What did they do with it? They just gave me regulations that made me be even less productive. Whereas if they take it out of your salary every week a little bit, and then sometimes April 15th they took out too much and they give you money back, I mean, this makes the government look good. Time is up. Yeah.
5-minute rebuttal to block.
Okay, a lot to rebuttal there, but I'm going to have some fun here. Okay, so first thing I'd like to get into is just one minor point before diving into Murray versus Milton, M versus M, libertarian versus anarchist, which is the point of just the left for a moment. And I would just recommend anyone just Google Charles Peralo, Bernie Sanders. You will find I do bash the left quite a bit. The reason that I talk about Murray Rothbard on this front is I've noticed the libertarian community does better with right-leaning individuals. We do very poorly trying to approach the left. So I just try and say, why aren't we getting the left more often? And I would say it's due to those Bernie Sanders, due to those Rothbard leanings. But if you'd like, in my next article about Rothbard, I'd be happy to attack him for supporting socialists as well and communists as well. But that will come. But, so Rothbard versus Friedman. So the first thing mentioned was the draft. He was able to get Henry Kissinger to be anti-draft. He was able to get Richard Nixon to be anti-draft. Milton Friedman was against Vietnam. He was against Korea. He was against Kuwait. He was actually, I believe, on his final days on this earth, talking about the Afghanistan war, he said that, you know, he supported invading Afghanistan, but he said we've gone about it all in the wrong way. Milton Friedman was an anti-war guy just like Murray Rothbard was. But we have this thing called the draft, which is basically a structure, we had this thing called the draft, which was this structure where we said that we called it a random thing where young men would go off to war, but it wasn't random. If you were wealthier, you would basically be told, hey, oh, you have the stamp saying you're going to college, oh, you're Donald Trump, oh, you're Mitt Romney, you're going as a Mormon missionary to France, oh, you don't have to do the draft, you can dodge it easily. But you know, you're a young minority kid out there, oh, you're definitely going to have to go to draft. So he said efficiency, and you know, he got more efficiency post leaving the draft. We talk about the Kuwait War, we talk about the Iraq War. They're definitely wrong in how they functioned, but they've operated so much better. We've had fewer Americans die. We have better trained people. We're actually working, offering better benefits. I mean, if we go to the post-Vietnam veterans, to the post-Iraq veterans, it's still awful, but Vietnam was far worse than how we've done with Iraq. So I look at it on that front saying, if you have to go to like Henry Kissinger's office or Richard Nixon's office or Donald Rumsfeld's office and say what you need to say to end the draft, and you're going to say efficiency, I mean, you could have the conversation, oh, by the way, guys, I think this war with Vietnam is totally messed up, but if you're going to do it better, at least do it voluntary over this slavery method we had with the draft, and he ended it. And, you know, it's a way to communicate and it's a way to handle things, but he never actually said, oh, I want more Vietnam, I want you to bomb people better. He just said, let's handle it better. But the next thing is school choice. And I just want to touch on that subject. This is what I call kind of like A to Z libertarianism, where we currently are at, whatever we're at now is A, and we want to get to Z. We need to go to B. And school choice is B. I mean, Elizabeth Warren supported school choice for many years. Cory Booker currently supports school choice. Almost every Republican supports school choice, and I'm happy to some extent. I mean, when Betsy DeVos is not selling Amway scams with her husband and making billions of dollars off that, I'm happy that she is out supporting school choice, and I'm happy Donald Trump agrees there. So it seems like there is a bipartisan effort on school vouchers. Now, when it comes to the school voucher structure, you have to structure in a way, which Milton Friedman talked about, where the goal was to ideally cut government over time. And if you go to the negative income tax or the school voucher system, you look at it, and he said, we're going to have school vouchers, but we're going to try and scale it down to eventually become voluntary. So he wanted to go from A to B, and we're eventually going to get to Z. That was the Milton Friedman plan on the negative income tax. The goal was abolish welfare. The goal was privatize schools, but it's how you get there, and his model worked better. And if we look at Hong Kong, we look at Chile, we look at countries that have adopted negative income tax and school vouchers, they've done better over what we have right now. We have a model where welfare is a social safety net in terms of a net being a trap that keeps you in. I would say the negative income tax is a social safety trampoline where it bounces you out. I would say school vouchers, the goal is to cut funds and make education more effective instead of, since let's see, since 1980, we've doubled education spending and not even gotten that much for our bang for the buck on that. And with that, I think I'm out of time, but Dr. Block, you're up, or Lewis, you're up.
I'm not even sure. Does he have the 5-minute rebuttal?
Yeah.
We're anarchists here.
Well, we're not really classical liberal here, anarchist there.
Well, we're anarchists on who speaks when, why, how, whatever.
We're laissez-faire.
Look, I've got a smoking gun on Milton Friedman. Look, I'm not in favor of the draft. Please, don't misquote me and think Block favors the draft. I don't favor the draft. And I agree with what Mr. Peralo said, that the draft, getting rid of the draft, is got some good things going for it. But I've got a smoking gun on Milton Friedman. He said that one of the reasons for getting rid of the draft during the Vietnam War was to make the U.S. military more efficient. There's no way he can slide out of that. You sort of got him there. I mean, that's a smoking gun. I mean, that's despicable. He says you have to go from A to B to C. You don't. You can go directly to C if C is the goal. Look, suppose we were in charge and it's 1850 and we're thinking we should get rid of slavery, and some moderate says, well, tut-tut, let's not get rid of slavery all at once. Let's get rid of slavery, 10% of the slaves, let's free 10% of the slaves every year for 10 years, and then slavery will end. Well, that's better than keeping slavery, but if we have the power to get rid of slavery entirely, and we get rid of it in this piecemeal direction of 10% each time, we're guilty for slavery for 90, 80, 70, 60, etc. percent. So the idea, look, somebody's got to say that restaurants should be privatized fully, and somebody's got to say that education has got to be privatized fully. Milton Friedman never said that. He never said that it was an en route thing. He never said that the goal is to have pure free enterprise in schooling, that schooling should be just as private enterprise as restaurants or bubblegum or bow ties. He never said that. He just said, let's have vouchers. Well, that's going from A to B, and it's not clear that it's going from A to B, namely, we're going in a positive direction. Yes, in some sense, it'll make public schools more efficient, because now they'll have to compete for customers. But do we want more efficient public schools? It's a very ticklish issue as to whether we do or not. Whereas the clear libertarian answer is, let's go to C, or whatever the end point is, let's go to the free enterprise system. He did that with the minimum wage. He never said, let's reduce the minimum wage by 10% every year. He never said, let's get rid of rent control gradually. He never said, let's get rid of tariffs gradually. He said, let's get rid of them all. He was a man. So why on this? Well, because he's not a consistent libertarian. He's not a consistent free enterpriser. Look, he didn't go from A to B to C to D on minimum wage. Bless his heart, he said, get rid of the bloody thing. I would say put the people in jail who were responsible for it. He never went that far. But, I mean, look, suppose I went into the inner city and I said, if you get a job, I'll shoot you. I'd be a bad guy. And yet, that's roughly what the minimum wage law does. Milton Friedman, bless his heart, was magnificent and consistent and lovely on free trade and minimum wage and occupational licensure and minimum wage and rent control and all sorts of things like that. He didn't compromise. So why compromise here? Why do we have to go from A to B to C? I don't see why we have to. Shouldn't somebody say, hey, C is the goal? At least if he had the decency to say C is the goal and B is a direction in that direction. But he never said that. What he said is that B is the goal. Let's have voluntary, vouchers. Milton Friedman, the Milton Friedman Foundation, you know what it's doing? Vouchers. Just vouchers. Nobody, go read their literature and see if they say that. Now, another thing that Mr. Peralo says is, we did this, whatever it was, had a negative income tax or whatever, and then things got better. My question as a logical economist is, did things get better because of or in spite of? Just because what you're doing is you're confusing constant conjunction, B follows A, and therefore A causes B? No. Just because A comes first and then B comes doesn't mean A caused B. It might be that we have B in spite of A. So you need a little economic logic here. You just can't be a historian and say, well, this happened and that happened, and therefore this caused that. No. This might have happened in spite of that happening. Things might have got better in spite of the negative income tax, or in spite of the Constitution. He said that, we had the Constitution and things got better. Well, yeah, sort of, maybe. But even if so, it doesn't mean that the Constitution caused it. It could have been in spite of the Constitution.
Okay, obviously there's going to be some overlap here. We're going to talk about Milton Friedman now. So, well, we were talking about Rothbard. So, your what's it, your boy?
My boy Milton Friedman. My man.
Your man. Here he is, Charles Peralo.
Okay, so that was a Rothbard debate that went into Friedman a lot, and I guess we're going to stay in Friedman again. Okay, so I think this is actually just going to be critically focused on the voucher model, the negative income tax, and what is the difference between saying you want to abolish the minimum wage and then you want to abolish welfare. If you abolish the minimum wage, the economy is going to improve overnight. Now, if you said you're going to do something like abolish the Department of Commerce, abolish the Department of Homeland Security, education, do something where you lay off jobs. If you go from A to Z automatically, you're going to have protests, you're going to kill the economy. We know this is a fact. You lay off people and there will be probably an immediate reaction where jobs are going to be lost and the economy will tank, and that short-term example will make it so Bernie Sanders gets elected in the next election. Now, if you look at occupational licensing, you look at the minimum wage, you look at a lot of these issues, you can go from A to Z overnight and there's not going to be a problem. If you were to scale down the minimum wage from $8 to $5, there'll probably be some positive effect, but no minimum wage is better. So Milton Friedman, I think, had a very simple thing, and this is why I say libertarian first, pragmatist second, because he had the libertarian principles, but then he said, how do we actually make it happen? And this goes into the example of who are we, where are we, why are we here, what do we do next? And I look at that and I say Milton Friedman on these examples, when it came to microeconomic regulatory policy, when it came to the FDA, he looked at it and said, we're in a bad situation, this is what we support, so we're going to go about this and say, what is the best way to handle it? The best way to handle the FDA is easily bring it up. Now, one thing Dr. Block mentions is slavery. In slavery, we actually did a method of scaling it down. And up until the Civil War, it was actually working because I believe in the East Coast versus the South, there was actually a very large percentage of the African American community in America who were free. And more people were being free every year. And there was no Civil War and automatic law banning it. In many parts of Europe or Asia, they scaled down, they made compromises, and they gradually adjusted. They said, we're going to end slavery, but end it over 10 years. So there have been compromises that work. There's some compromises that don't work. A system where you're going to say, okay, we're going to reduce slavery in the states that don't even care about it, but we're going to expand it in southern states that focus on like the agricultural industry. That's a different example. So every